Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is longtime and outgoing CEO of APTN, Jean LaRose. LaRose is from Abenaki First Nation of Odanak in Quebec. He was raised in Ottawa, where he studied journalism at Algonquin College and obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Social Communication at the University of Ottawa. Jean has been the CEO of APTN since 2002. He has announced he will be leaving the network at the end of 2019. Jean, thanks so much for taking some time for us here today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
You've been with APTN for nearly 17 years, almost since the beginning. But when you were brought in, it was tough times at the network. APTN was still in its infancy, but close to losing it all almost. How do you reflect on those days?
Well, they certainly were a challenge. When I came on board, I really had no idea what the situation was here. It quickly came to realization that we were in a bit of a difficult spot. The first couple of weeks I was here, the bank called me over to let me know that they were about to pull the plug. We were out of money. They kept returning checks because we didn't have the funds to pay for them, and on and on and on. So the challenge was to get the bank to hold off, but then to work with them to find processes and opportunities for them to regain confidence in the network. So it meant from pretty well day one that the first year we had to cut back a lot of our programming. We had to inform our producers that we couldn't afford any programming in year one. For a lot of them, that was a disastrous decision. Many of them had counted on a renewed license to maintain their business. So all around, it was pretty difficult on a lot of people. But after in the beginning of the second year and a half or so, that's when things started to calm down. We were able to sort of get back into growing the network, growing APTN, but also look at how we were going to expand it and started developing our future strategy. And since then, we haven't looked back.
There were reports at the time from an investigative reporter who now works here, actually, that the company was $6 million in debt or so. The news team didn't know if they were, like you say, going to have jobs. What did it take to turn things around?
Well, as I said, the first thing we had to do is to stop spending. So obviously our biggest expense is programming. We didn't want to cut on the news service because we felt that was an important one. So that meant all programming had to be put on hiatus for a year. It also meant that we had to come to an agreement with the bank on how we were going to repay, what kind of arrangement they demanded from us. We brought in a CFO at the time, Wilfred Blondy. Wilfred was instrumental in helping us on the financial side. He'd worked for other organizations, other indigenous organizations. His reputation with the bank was quite high. So he was a key player in helping us negotiate with the bank terms and conditions that we could live with, even though they were harsh. We had some pretty severe operational restrictions put on us, but and that assessment was right. We were nearly $6 million in the red, and there was no way we could have continued that way for any length of time. So it meant drastic changes, drastic measures, and we did what we had to do for the betterment of the network and to make sure it would still be here today.
Did it take a toll on you personally? There are a lot of politics involved, a lot of hard decisions involved as well.
Well, it did take a toll at the time because, as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, a lot of our producers ended up either losing their company or being in a very severe financial situation during that period. And that was certainly one of the toughest calls we had to make. From my end, having talked to many of those producers, it was very heart-wrenching too, because for some it meant their entire livelihood was going out the window. So, yeah, those were very difficult times. They were emotionally stressful. But I think many of the other producers who also realized the position we were in turned around and said, we know it has to be done. We'll do our best to be around next year to keep this going. And I think that's the part that really encouraged the rest of the team here to keep working hard to make sure we'd be here for the long term.
And there have been many successes since that time. One of them would be the 2010 Olympics and APTN's involvement in that. And can you talk a bit about that experience and how things came to be?
Well, that I think was, in some ways for us internally, it was a bit of a turning point. When we launched, a lot of the other media sort of felt that APTN was, one of them called us a guilt tax on Canadians because we had a subscriber fee. Another media called us a social engineering experiment gone crazy. So we had to prove ourselves in ways that others don't have to. And when the Olympics were announced and the consortium started talking about the fact they wanted to bring in a lot of people, we approached them, and in part we were approached also by the Omni Network. At the time, Madeleine Zignac was leading the charge over there, and she felt that APTN needed to be part of the consortium. But there was some reluctance on the overall management because they felt that we probably couldn't live up to the expectations of what was needed for an Olympic broadcast. Initially, they only offered us the opening and closing ceremonies in language. That was it. But we weren't ready to accept that, so we turned it down and said the only thing we'll accept is an opportunity to have a range of the events in language as well as English and French. And we want to have some of the key events too. We believe, there's no reason why we can't have, let's say, a gold medal game in one sport, either in language or in English or French. Our audience doesn't deserve any less. So we were fortunate that we were negotiating with a group, the leadership over then, that agreed that there needed to be more. And then when the pressure on them to start delivering more content on more platforms and everything else kept building up, they came back to us and said, okay, well, actually, we need you to do more, maybe even more than what you expected. So we ended up with about 14 or 15 hours a day over the full 17 days of the Olympics. And for the year before that, we had to train our speakers to do play-by-play of Olympic events. Most of them had never done any of this. We had the Nepinax here, a couple of elders, who, if I remember correctly, they did, amongst other things, figure skating and other sports in language, but they had to create words for it, or expressions. There's no traditional word for a triple axel, or no traditional word for a snowboard, or a triple whatever they call those things. So all of a sudden, we had a group of people that were learning how to do it, but at the same time had to go back with their communities and others and come to an agreement on what a term or a word would be to describe what they would be doing the play-by-play on. So that was a whole year undertaking. And from that, we actually published 8 little dictionaries of expressions that were created in language and then sent them off to the communities where that language is used. So I think what it did for the network, certainly for the staff here, and I've heard it ever since, many of them have said, in their view, they not only felt proud to be part of APTN, but they now knew that they could do what everybody else was doing. And since then, if you look at how we've grown and how we've expanded, the type of coverage we've done, whether it's the first ever NHL game in Cree we did this winter, we now have a team that's confident of taking on anything, whereas before 2010, they were unsure.
And you still hear staff speaking about it now, those who were part of that. What do you think it meant for the broader community as well to see their people, pulling this off and airing this?
Well, the amount of reaction we got from our communities was astounding. We had people calling in tears saying, I can't believe I'm hearing my language at an international Olympic event. I can't believe that. We had elders thanking us. We had young people saying, it validates my language. This is incredible. Thank you for doing this. So the reaction across the board was very, very positive. And even the IOC, from what I was told, and I've never actually seen the report, but I was told that in their final report, they recognized the work that APTN had done as not only being groundbreaking, but of the highest quality. So here all of a sudden the little network that couldn't became the little network that could, and what the team here did is second to none. We've actually created history a few times when it comes to Indigenous achievements, and that is certainly one of them.
We've got to take a quick break, but stick around. We'll be right back to continue our conversation with Jean LaRose here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is a longtime CEO of APTN, Jean LaRose, who has announced that he will be moving on from the network at the end of the year. And before the break, we were talking about some of the milestones for the network for its first 19 years on the air. And one of those milestones, I would have to say, Jean, was the launching of First People's Radio, Element Radio in Toronto and Ottawa. And I guess maybe a little on why APTN wanted to make the move to radio.
Well, the urban centers really have no radio presence, Indigenous radio presence. When years ago, about the same time as APTN was licensed, Aboriginal Voices Radio was also licensed and was given the opportunity to acquire licenses across the country. Unfortunately, they had many challenges, and the network eventually folded, lost its license. We still, as we know, 55% or so of our communities live in urban centers, many of them in these major centers. So we applied for some of those licenses. We got 2 of the 5. Other broadcasters got the other 3. But it gives us the chance to not only make our artists better known in those communities, in Ottawa and Toronto, because 25% of the content is Indigenous musicians, Indigenous artists, when we hope over time to grow that, but we're starting with 25. And it's allowed people in those 2 communities to experience a type of music they were never experienced with. They never had the opportunity to hear quite often. And the reaction has been quite positive. We've been getting a lot of very good feedback about who's this artist, never heard about him or her, that's amazing, and it has kept on growing. So we think the advantage to it is that it not only brings us into a medium that is still very strong in our communities. If you go into a lot of our small communities, they'll have maybe a low power radio station where there's talking language or not, or they play music, and it's almost like way back when radio was a family thing where people would sit around and listen to it. It often seems in our communities that radio still has that drawing power. So up to now, we've seen the same reaction in Ottawa and Toronto within our community. Now the goal obviously is to expand that to the rest of the audience over there and try to get more of them to experience not only our musicians and our artists, but also some of our stories through our lens, through our newscasts and through some of our programming like Moment of Truth, which looks at issues from the Indigenous perspective as opposed from the mainstream perspective. So we think there is a lot of opportunity at a time when we're all talking about reconciliation, which in many ways is getting to know each other, understand each other, and accept each other for who we are. Well, part of that is to know the other side's story. And many people are trapped in their cars, especially in Toronto, for 2.5 hours for the morning commute, and then the same for the afternoon commute.
Hey, what's going on? My name is Juice Man Jonathan Shaw. I'm filling in for Julian Taylor between the hours of 3 and 7 p.m. on The Cruise. And don't forget, this is 106.5 Element FM, the spirit of Toronto.
if we can start connecting with them during that period, and they get to understand and hear some of our stories told from our words, but also some of our artists or musicians and some of the events that they might be attending, I think it opens up a whole new set of doors to not only our community, our artistic community, but maybe to APTN by extension, because these people may then be interested in finding out a bit more about what APTN is too, since we cross-promote each other. We promote Element here on the network, and Element promotes us on the radio.
APTN established this for us a while back, but to have a platform that's radio, that people, you know, they're trapped in their cars, they want new information, they want new music. I just think this is a great way to reach a new community and have people learn about, you know, Indigenous values and culture and hear what we're doing, because what we're doing is always awesome.
The goal down the road would be, you know, certainly to have a national presence, over time add more cities and with stations, so that we can connect with more people across the country, and certainly we can better tell our stories. I've always been a very, very strong proponent that Indigenous people are the best ones to tell Indigenous stories. Other mainstream networks will tell our stories, but they will tell part of our stories, or they'll tell it from their perspective. They'll look at it from an outside point of view and say, well, this is the important part of that story, or that's the important part of the story. Where for us, that's irrelevant. It is part of the story, but that's not the key part. The key part is, why is all of this happening? So it allows us to tell those stories to a broader audience in a different way. And we hope that through the radio network, we'll start connecting with possibly Canadians who haven't discovered us yet, who don't really know who we are, or who may have listened to us a bit years ago on TV and then sort of moved on to other things. And because it's also something that goes on a platform, we're streaming, what have you, we're getting pickups from outside the country as well, people who are tuning us in. So it's a whole, when you look at the environment right now, everything's changing. Our audience is now splintered everywhere. Our recent surveys have showed us that, you know, Indigenous audience is no different than mainstream audience. They're on their tablets, they're on their laptops, they're on their smartphones, they're everywhere to get what they want when they want. And we have to be everywhere. And that's part of the reason for Element, and it's also part of the reason for Lumi, our new over-the-top service that we launched on June 3rd.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. We'll be right back to continue our conversation with outgoing APTN CEO Jean LaRose right here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is APTN CEO Jean LaRose, who has announced he will be leaving the company at the end of 2019. Before the break, we were discussing some of the major accomplishments the network has achieved over the past 20 years. One of the more recent milestones was Rogers' hometown hockey in Cree. We pick up the conversation now with how it all came together on March 24th, 2019.
We've been, I guess the best way to put it is, we've been bugging the Sportsnet to consider, and Rogers, when they got the rights to the NHL, to consider allowing APTN to carry some of the NHL games with them. And because, again, of their arrangement with the NHL, initially there didn't seem to be much stomach for it. But in the last couple of years, the reaction was not necessarily negative. It was mostly, well, let's see what we can do. And last year, after an email I sent to the CEO of Rogers, we got a phone call from the Sportsnet people saying, let's sit down and talk and see what we can do. So from that, the programming team met with them. They negotiated over a few months what would be the what could we do, what were we being asked to do, and also trying to determine, can we afford it. At that point in time, it was also a question of feasibility, financial feasibility. But what came out of it was an arrangement that allows us to cover that game the Classic out in Edmonton, well, actually in the surrounding community, a First Nations community. And it also allowed us to bring in people like Clarence Iron and others who are amazing play-by-play people. I mean, the reaction we got from Canadians to his calling of the game is second to none. Some people wrote to us and said, I just tuned it in because I just wanted to hear what it sounded like. But the guy was so exciting, I watched the whole game. I didn't understand a word he said, but I could figure the play by the names he was calling, and he just kept me going. He just kept me excited about the game. I watched the whole thing. So obviously something like this also connects with Canadians, not only with our community, but with Canadians who have shown an interest in who we are, what we do, and I think it's the type of event that will help open doors in our relationship with Canada.
I think there were a lot of people who posted and said, I tuned in for the novelty at first, but the excitement of the calls is what kept me around and kept me watching. Yep. Jean, is there an opportunity for more of these games to take place?
Well, we're in fact talking to Sportsnet now. In an ideal world, certainly we would like to have at least one game a week. Can we afford it? I'm not sure, because obviously there is a cost to that. And especially given the fact that our play-by-play team and our commentators are from all over the West. To try to fly them in one spot on a weekly basis basically means we have to win Lotto Max a few times over, which chances are nil since we don't buy the tickets. Yeah. So we have to see what can we do. So we're looking at maybe one game a month to start, see how we can afford that, see how it goes, how it plays out with the with our commentators. And if that ends up working out well, then we certainly look at how can we expand it, maybe even add other languages down the road. Certainly, if I were here for the longer term, I'd be looking to see how can we add, say, Inuktitut and have that game on the north feed, have maybe Mohawk and have it on the east feed so that the Cree is on the west feed. So we have, languages of some of the major groups in each of the three regions actually being the ones to do the play-by-play of the games. That would be an ultimate goal, but that's probably a few years down the road.
That's all the time we have for today's show, but we will be continuing the conversation with APTN's longtime and outgoing CEO, Jean LaRose, next week on the show, where we discuss the evolution of Indigenous Day Live, APTN's move to streaming, and whether there's a name change in the plans for APTN. And a reminder that this show and all past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptn.ca/face-to-face podcast. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. I'm Dennis Ward.